Hemisphere Affairs, the Office for Central American Affairs. Before that, he served as a political officer covering corruption and the justice sector and the embassy in Tegucigalpa, and among other places. So, Chase, after your presentation, we'll open the microphone for a short Q&A segment with our academics and students. Please, go ahead.
First of all, thank you so much for coming.
You have people there on that.
There.
There, okay.
No, there.
Right.
Thank you all so much for having me today. I'm very impressed by the turnout for you guys, that there's so many people here. There's so much interest in our election process. It can be complicated, it can be dramatic, it could be interesting. And so I'm really anxious to get through the part of my presentation that I've got for you, just sort of go over the basics. But what I'm really interested here is to be present for your questions and answers, so I can answer the questions about the stuff that doesn't make any sense, and maybe you can stump me, like happened in the last one of these we did. So and I also really appreciate I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and the opportunity to speak in English. I do speak Spanish, like a poco, pero like it's better if I don't have to invent mis límites en español. And it's something that's so nuanced and so has so many potential implications. So let's go to the first one. Well, while he's getting that set up, let me just take a minute to talk about how I'm going to go through the presentation. We'll start with a little bit of history of why elections are important, what are some historical dates that made it more a bit more interesting, and talk about sort of the very basic stuff. Then we'll talk about the cycle, the sort of timing, how it happens every 4 years, how different timings are for different types of elections, and what the key dates are for this specific election, including tonight, the vice presidential debate, which I don't think is on my list, but it'll address as well. Then I'll sort of get into the meat of it. I want to talk about the difference between primaries and caucuses and how the process of primaries and caucuses work. Because I think that's something that's a little bit different in the United States and something a lot of people can be confused about, so I can answer questions there as well. I want to talk about the political parties. I'm not necessarily talk about the positions of political parties, but let's talk about how political parties function in our system, why they're important in the process, and what role they play in how things go forward. I'm also going to talk about the Electoral College, which I know is something that is very interesting to people and very confusing. It still confuses me, but we'll get through it together, and we'll talk about how that process is a little bit different than some other places. The other thing I want to talk about is campaign financing, how elections are paid for, how presidential candidates get their money, and how money plays a part in our process. I think that's another font of another place where people might have some questions that we can discuss in more detail. One thing I can't do, because of the laws of the United States, is talk about who's going to win or how I feel about it or anything like that. We have a law called the Hatch Act, prevents us from doing it as diplomats. I'm here as a representative of the United States to talk about the process of our elections, not about how I'm going to vote or how I think you should vote or anything like that. So I'll stay away from that as much as I can. We're still trying to find this.
1 second.
Yeah.
I think we can get to the next thing. We've got the slides. It's fine. So an overview of U.S. elections, right? So elections happen in the United States for president every 4 years, for Congress every 2 years, for senators every 6 years, and then there are various sort of down ballot races, for sheriffs and judges and governors that happen at different times based on different state rules. It can be very complicated, but sort of the headline for today, the reason we're going to talk about this is that the presidential election happens every 4 years. You can be elected president twice to non-consecutive terms, as we're seeing in our current situation. And they're, of course, important because this is how the people check the power of the government, right? This is how the people tell the government what they want to have done, and what they want, how they want the country to be governed. That happens at the local level with the sheriffs and judges I talked about earlier. It happens at the state level in Congress with the representatives and senators, and it happens at the national level with the president. Obviously, you're giving the president a lot of power, right? He appoints all of the executive branch. He's technically my boss. He's technically Omar's boss. A couple rungs up from here. So it's very important that that person is, what their philosophy is, how they see the world, and that's why it's important to votes and important that people's sort of opinions are represented in their leadership.
Now he's ready.
Now it's ready.
Nice.
Okay. It'll like the overs. We're on. Sure.
Just a second, los de internet lo pueden ver.
Next one.
Let's take it. A couple of.
Sí, ya.
She's quitting. Okay. Couple of important dates. The first US election was held between 1788 and 1789. That's where we got George Washington. Famously was offered the kingship of the United States and chose instead to step down because he wanted to be the president, not king. He signed the Voting Rights Act in 1965 to give all people, all races the right to vote. Which was interestingly a long time after the 19th Amendment was passed in 1990, when it gave women the right to vote.
What starts?
1919 was when we gave women the right to vote. And frankly, we're still talking about that stuff today. Another important date is 1971, when the voting age in the United States is 18 years old. It was lowered from 21 years old. The reason those are important is that in the United States, because of a weird highway thing, you can't drink alcohol to 21, but you can vote, you can be in the army, and do everything else. So that changed in 1971. The last big contested election, of course, was not the last one, but the first really contested election was between George W. Bush and Al Gore. We can talk about how that went down. There was recounts. There was a decision by the Supreme Court. So that obviously opens up a lot of questions about, what the court's role is, what position they could play if things are contested going forward in this election. So that's an important touchstone to think of circling back to how we dealt with it in the past. And then, of course, we had in 2008, we got Barack Obama elected the first Black president, which is a good thing. So now we're on key dates. So the key dates for the 2024 edition of the presidential election. So we've already gone through the primary process. Primaries are the way before the beginning of the election process that parties decide who their representatives are going to be in the national election. Obviously, the Democratic and Republican Party go through a process state by state where they decide where each state decides who their representatives are going to vote for in the national convention. Each party has a national convention. You see them, lots of balloons, lots of streamers. That sort of culminates that process where the Democrats and the Republicans nominate a representative to be their standard bearer in the presidential election. Primaries and caucuses are different state to state. The calendar is decided by state by parties. So the Democrats decide that they want New Hampshire to go first, then Ohio, and then Republicans can do something completely different. And they have their own rules about how they're conducted, which brings me to the difference between primaries and caucuses. Primaries are essentially a vote where either members of a political party or everyone from the state can choose who they vote for among a set of candidates from a specific party, or a caucus in which people get together at the local level and have a discussion about it in a one-night process, and then they vote, and then their representatives vote in a state thing, which determines who the state electors pick. I'll go into more detail on that a little bit further down the line. You might have heard of Super Tuesday. Super Tuesday is just it sounds very important, but it's just a thing a lot of primaries have. The reason it's called Super Tuesday in the past is that it would usually be unclear who the party representatives were going to be until that day, because so many primaries took place. That person would get over the limits and be chosen as the nominee for a specific party. What is the limit? It's different from party to party, and frankly, I don't even remember the numbers between the Democrats and the Republicans. But there's some number of electors who go to the convention and in order to be the representative majority of those electors, and that was usually decided on Super Tuesday. Let's see, so the general election campaign period is the period after the primary process until election day. Election day this year is November 5th, so we're in the general election process right now. That's when everyone will go and vote for the nominees that the parties have picked, and one of them will be the president-elect. Which brings me to our first touch on the Electoral College. Technically, that the vote of the Electoral College is what matters. So individual votes tell state electors how they want the electors to vote at the Electoral College, which takes place in December. Electors are, I guess, morally bound to respect the will of the people who have decided, I want this person or this person to be president. Those electors vote, and technically the Electoral College vote is what decides the presidency. There are 538 electors, you need 270 to win, and we'll go into detail on that in a little while here. The last step of the process before the actual inauguration is the congressional certification of the electoral votes. So the electoral votes are taken in December, and then in January, Congress and the sitting vice president certify that the votes have been delivered to them in a sort of procedural thing that says, we agree that this is supposed to be the president. And then the inauguration day is January 20th, 2025 this year. Spoke a little bit already about how primary days are chosen. It's really a combination of what state law, tradition, what parties want, and it's not something that's standardized per state. It's something that it even changes year to year. I think for instance, the Democrats this year moved Georgia up the electoral calendar. Obviously, if you're earlier in the electoral calendar, you're more important in the final results. You sort of set the tone. The Democrats chose to move Georgia up the calendar as a sort of reward from President Biden for voting for him in 2000. What was it? 2020. Yeah, I can't remember my dates. But so yeah, all that to say that that those states are movable, malleable, and certain states become outsizably important because of where they sit in those calendars. That's why the Iowa caucus is important. That's why the New Hampshire primary is important. It's not that Iowa and New Hampshire are particularly important states or any bigger or mean anything to the national process more than any other one. But being at the front of the calendar means that that they are sort of involved in eliminating some of the original candidates or makes their decisions a little more important than the other ones. Primary process. No, I'm one ahead of myself here. So there are a couple different types of primaries. The closed primary is a primary where only people who are registered in a specific political party can vote. So you can see how that might impact how different candidates are perceived, right? If you're a centrist Democrat, maybe you want Republicans to vote in the primary so that they can give you a little bit of support to beat the really liberal Democrat, right? So that has some impact on how some states, on how some states pick their primary winners. In an open primary, everybody can vote. So as I just mentioned, Republicans can vote for Democrats, Democrats can vote for Republicans. And that's and so it's totally open. And then of course there's a mix between the two, the semi-closed primary, where if I need to get this right, registered party members and unaffiliated voters. So if you don't have a party or you're from the party voting, then you can vote. And so the unaffiliated voters can vote both ways, and it's very complicated very quickly. The point is that none of these primaries are standardized. They're all different. Like the New Hampshire primary is not the same as the Ohio primary, is not the same as the California primary. So all those processes they're all impacted different ways that the nominees are going to be. Primary function caucuses. I alluded to this a little bit earlier. Primaries are basically votes, as I just described. Caucuses are sort of a more traditional process where people get together in their communities. the night of the event and talk amongst themselves and take multiple votes. And at the end of a process that evening, those votes are sort of tallied at the local level and passed on to the state level where they decide who won the caucus. Not obvious, but the most commonly cited ones is the Iowa caucus. We're talking about like in a schoolhouse, 15 people getting together and arguing with each other over who should be the Republican nominee. And then they come out, with, we think it should be this person, and then that sort of filters up into the full-on Iowa process. That has real implications for how political campaigns work, because influencing those groups of 15 voters is much different than putting out an advertisement over across the entire state for people to vote on. So those kind of things, when you get into the detail, really do matter in how these things go forward. So let's talk a little bit about the political parties. We've already sort of mentioned the Democratic and the Republican Party, right? But I think one thing that's critical for this group to understand, because you guys are more expert than the layperson, is that there are like a million political parties in the United States. It's just that the Republicans and Democrats are the only ones that have any real power. There are, like for instance, there's the Libertarian Party, there's the Green Party, there's the Constitution Party, the Working Families Party, the Socialist Party. We have socialists in the United States. The point I want to make about these is even though you don't see them on CNN, and even though they may not be, they may not have all the clout or have seats in Congress. For instance, this Constitution Party was founded in 1992, and in 2000 it received 60,000 votes. So 6,000 votes is only 0.04% of the popular vote, but that's 60,000 people, right? So like a lot of people are going out and voting for the Constitution Party, right? They're not Republicans, they're not Democrats. They care about a strong emphasis on returning to constitutional government and reducing the federal government's role in promoting social values. But all that to say that when you go to the ballot box and you get a ballot that has 10, 15 people on it, right? There will be winners. There will be Donald Trump, and then there's going to be 8 people you've never heard of. And those people represent these small parties and do really get votes and can actually influence the outcome of elections in some cases. The last time it was really important, the last time third party influence was really important was in 1992. Ross Perot stayed in the race for a pretty long time. He ended up getting 19% of the vote. So obviously 19 is, it's not a plurality, it's not a majority. It's not going to win you the election, but it's going to affect how the other two do. So these things can be very important. In this election, RFK Jr., who's since had a couple of mishaps, was in the race for a long time, and the question was, what were his voters going to do? Where were they going to land? And I don't know how the questions you would answer, but the third parties and other parties do have an effect on our elections outside the Democratic and Republican process. I also want to talk about why political parties matter. We talked about it a little bit over the course of this discussion. Has been a discussion I've been talking. We'll discuss later. But the reason those smaller parties are less important is because they don't have the organization. They're not able to go out and do things like the big parties do. What does a party have to do? Well, they have to get their candidates. They have to get their candidates on the ballot. They have to run the primary process. Getting candidates on the ballot requires money. It requires signatures from people who want them to be on the ballot. And without the infrastructure, without local offices all across the country, sometimes it's difficult for other smaller parties to do that. So they do matter. They're also sort of the source of where the candidates might come from, the nominated candidates. I think the first question, if you want to be the Democratic candidate for president, is whether the Democratic Party is okay with that, whether you sort of whether you align with their values, whether you're in with their organization. So while they don't necessarily pick the primary process is what picks the nominee. The field is set by the party organizations, so they do play an important role in there, as sort of setting the playing field to make that happen. The political parties are also sort of places where policies are developed and voters are mobilized. Policy development is important because at the convention, the Democrats and Republicans will agree to what's called a party platform, which is basically a set of principles that says, like, this is what we believe as this political party, And then that is what the presidential nominee will take into the general election process to present to all the voters. So that process and developing those policies is very important. Whether it's mentioned at all, how hard a position is on one thing or another is very important to sort of lever to pull in the election process. I also mentioned voter mobilization. Another reason that smaller parties have more difficult time, even though they got 60,000 people, is that they're unable to mobilize the millions of people that one needs to vote for them in the general election, right? The general election, the participation rate in the general election, 30%, not very high, but that's still like, tens of millions of people. So it takes a significant effort for political parties to A, persuade those people to vote, and B, persuade those people to actually go through the process of voting on election day. I think a lot of people may not be as enthusiastic about the process as other people. They may not want to do it. They might reign in their district that day. But political parties are sort of instrumental in making sure that those voters get out and make their voices heard. Yeah. Take the time out here to talk about financing procedures. So this is probably the first of two topics I think are the most sort of not controversial, but hard for people to understand. There are two main laws that govern election finance procedures in the United States. The first is the Federal Election Campaign Act. The second is the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. The Federal Election Campaign Act was passed in 1971, so it's very old. It requires disclosure of donations. It requires disclosure of donations, and it has limits for candidates receiving contributions. It also establishes the Federal Election Commission, which is sort of like our sort of nonpartisan electoral council to sort of govern how elections are run in the country. We'll get to the contribution limits in a second and the disclosure programs in a second. But those were originally created by the Federal Election Campaign Act. The Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act was passed in 2002. Sort of tight restrictions a little bit on how money is used in U.S. elections. It banned what's called soft money, which is unregulated contributions by national political parties and candidates. So basically, the idea is that the money that goes into a political campaign is accountable. Like we know that I gave it, or you gave it, or the school gave it, so that people's sort of conflicts of interest are at least documented, if not prevented. The DCRA, excuse me, also restricted the use of issued advocacy ads. In the past, in order to avoid the campaign contribution limitations, people or institutions or organizations would use issues that they knew were specific to individual parties to essentially advocate for a candidate. So for instance, maybe it's I want to support Ronald Reagan, but I don't want to use the word Ronald Reagan. So I say I like building aircraft carriers or whatever. So you make an ad about aircraft carriers, but really what that means is you should vote for Reagan. So this act tried to sort of restrict that with limited success. It increased the contribution limits, which is more of an inflation thing, and it also increased some disclosure requirements. So what are those limits? Individuals in the United States can contribute up to $3,300 per candidate per election. You can contribute once during the primary and once during the general election. And any contribution that's over $200 has to be reported to the Federal Election Commission. It has to be, so a campaign will receive it from you and say, Jace gave me $3,300, and that's to ensure that I don't give it again, or that I don't give over the limit. You can give to both parties, and people often do. So you might ask, if it's $3,300 per person, how are corporations, how is there more money than that in the election? Because this election costs like $1 trillion. So political action committees are issue-based organizations that have a contribution limit, unlike super PACs, we can get to in a second. They can contribute up to $5,000 per, to each federal candidate and up to $15,000 annually to each party committee. So there are PACs that are for an issue, like I don't know, I'm a PAC for cookie makers. I care about cookie related issues. So I'm gonna give you $5,000 and as long as you vote yes to cookies. Then there are others that are affiliated, that are not connected, they're independent groups. Either way, political action committee, regardless of, you could, they call them things like the, Oklahoma Leadership Committee. You can have as many of these you want, but they have to report their what they've contributed and what they've gotten. But the difference is super PACs. Super PACs are they're expenditure only organizations. They're like political action committees, but they can take unlimited contributions from individuals or corporations. The limitation is that they cannot coordinate with a candidate or their campaign, and they can't donate directly. So as I was mentioning before about the Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier situation, that's how you do the Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier situation now. You form the aircraft carrier super PAC, and you spend unlimited money to talk about how much you like aircraft carriers. And in fact, you can say like, and I think you should vote for Ronald Reagan because of it. As long as you're not coordinating directly with Ronald Reagan's campaign, that is a legal use of super PAC money. They have to disclose their donors and their expenditures, but they don't have to disclose the amounts. So if Omar gives 25 million and I gave $1, we just appear the same on the list. Apparently, we both really like aircraft. Interestingly, the United States actually has public financing for presidential campaigns. The problem is that the amount of money that's spent on presidential campaigns has eclipsed the level of public expenditure. So most candidates, every candidate you've probably ever heard of, say no to the public contribution because taking public contributions means you can't take other contributions. And the other contributions are just so astronomically high that people wouldn't do that. Let's talk about let's come out of order, but that's fine. We'll get to the electoral college in a second. First, I'll talk about the beyond the president elections. One thing I want everyone to understand is that, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier. So even though the headline and what we're all here to talk about is the presidential election, on election day in the United States, we have a lot of different elections. I mentioned Congress. So every year, all 435 seats for our lower house of Congress, the House of Representatives, are reelected. So they're constantly in campaign mode. The upper house of our Congress, the Senate, is elected every 6 years. So every election cycle, 33% of senators are up for reelection. And the way that shakes out, could favor or disadvantage Democrats or Republicans based on what seats are up, what year. It could be 2 seats from one Democratic state, or it could be one and one from and that determines how the balance of power in those houses might flip. So there are the elections for governors this year. There are 11 states and 2 territories in the whole election for governor. Their governors have different term limits based on which state you're from. But so it's different every year, but governors are up at the same time. States have legislatures too, that hold elections, that have in their state senates and state houses that in different that have different rules for how their elections go. So those will also be on the ballot. Local municipal elections I mentioned. And then another thing that I think confuses some people is that sometimes often there will be ballot measures on the ballot. What is a ballot measure? A ballot measure is something that's specific to your state or locality that's about a specific issue. So sometimes they will take an issue all the way to the people. Should we build a parking lot here is a good example. But another example that might get more national attention is an abortion ban. And I think that's something you'll hear a lot about here in this election. Some states have measures on the ballot about restricting abortion rights, which could have an effect on how many people turn out to vote on. So some people may, for instance, be particularly animated by that issue and choose to come out and vote when they wouldn't have voted normally, which could have an effect on races that are further up the ballot or other races entirely. So ballot measures are like quintessential democracy, right? It's we're voting on this issue that we care about, all the facts in front of us, and it affects me at whatever level I'm voting on. But in the election overall, it could pull people in or dissuade people who might not. Vote. Okay, so the electoral college, which is the second thing that I think everybody is confused about. The electoral college was a system that was established in the United States at the founding. One of the founding philosophies of the United States system is a resistance to the tyranny of the majority. So even though it's democracy, there are a lot of safeguards built into our political system to make sure that 50% plus one person can't totally rule over the 49% remain. And the electoral college is an example of that. There are 538 electors in the electoral college, which is the sum of the members of Congress, which is two per district, 435, and the senators, which is 100, or 438 plus 100. The reason the House and the Senate are made that way, the Senate there are 2 senators per state to make sure that every state, regardless of size or population, has equal representation in that House. And the members of Congress are based on population. So every 10 years, we do a census where we figure out how people live in what district. And that changes the composition of the congressional districts. This is what makes a state like California more powerful than a state like Rhode Island, right? So every state's, the sum of their House of Representatives and their senators, which is always 2, is the number of electoral votes that each state has. So in the case of like Wyoming, that number is 3, right? It's 2 senators and one giant congressional district. In the case of California or New York, it's in the 50s. So it's some states are disproportionately more important than others based on their electoral college votes. As I sort of tripped over trying to enunciate before, when voters go and do their votes on election day, all that's really doing is indicating to the state's electors how that state would like them to vote. And this is where it gets complicated. This is where it continues to get complicated. Some states are winner take all, meaning that if 51% of the voters of the state, vote for Kamala Harris, then all the electors are compelled to vote for Kamala Harris, so they get all the electoral votes. Some states are proportional, meaning that 51% of the popular vote equals 51% of the electoral college vote, and so they get split the state between Harris. So when you look at those maps that are on the New York Times or on 538, trying to predict who's what and what are the swing states, that's all related to the electoral college map, right? Because that's at the end of the day what really matters. We've had, I think it's 3 in a row times when the winner of the U.S. election is not the winner of the popular vote, meaning that more people in the United States writ large voted for somebody else than the person who's actually the president. That's because of the electoral college. So anyway, back to those maps. So a swing state is a state that can go either way, because the voters in that state are split, very close one way or the other. And so those states sort of sit in the middle between various we're states that are going to end up in the Democrats' column and states that are going to end up in the Republicans' column. And that delta is sort of the straight those are. So as I said, 270 to get to win the election. And the reason for that is that's just over half of the well, it's not just over half, it's the only way the math you can't get to exactly half because of the way the state's math works. So 270 is the first number where you're one past halfway in the electoral college. So the Democrats are probably sitting at 230, the Republicans are probably sitting at 210, sort of like guaranteed this is going to happen. Like we know that New York is going to be a blue state, so there's no reason to talk about it. Pennsylvania, we don't know about, and Arizona, we don't know about, and Wisconsin, we don't know about. And so There's a lot of discussion about Canada's paths to victory, about the blue wall, which I can get into in more detail if you guys would like. But the bottom line is that candidates are looking for a way to put together 270 electoral votes through a combination of states based on their electoral college weights. So it doesn't make any sense for Donald Trump to go campaign in pick a blue state in California, because he's not going to win California. And California's winner take all, so that's a waste of time, right? So, but every vote that he gets in Pennsylvania matters, because that one person could put you over and get all of Pennsylvania's 20 electoral votes, which gets you that much closer to the 270 you need to win. So that's why the presidential candidates are spending all their time in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. Like those states matter. Like, yeah, everyone knows that Donald Trump's going to win Wyoming. No reason to know. But in Pennsylvania, it doesn't matter. So that's a little bit about the electoral vote. Obviously, it's a system that faces some criticism. As I mentioned, there have been several elections in our past, and particularly the last couple, where the popular vote hasn't lined up with the way the electoral college turned out. And that's obviously, some call it undemocratic, we can discover that. But that's how our system works. So it's but like I said, it's founded on a very American philosophy to protect people from the tyranny of the majority. 50% plus one, it should not rule outright. There should be a little bit of some room for dissension in there. I think that is the end of my prepared remarks. But I'm very happy to answer your questions. So again, thank you for having me. Thank you for your attention. I know I talked a lot there. I said a lot. I was talking for a little bit. But yeah, I'm happy to answer any question you guys might have about it. Yeah, and from the what you said, it disappeared.
So thanks, Chase. We have a couple of questions from the people watching online, but we're gonna take first some questions from our students or academics.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the conference. I had a question regarding taking into consideration the importance of swing states and undecided voters. Has any law or norm taken place to regulate the use of social media by parties related to campaigning, whether it's on a federal or state level?
I'm not aware of any law that restricts the use of social media by any political candidate or political party or super PAC or any sort of entity in the political system. Obviously there's some complications with all social media where running across disinformation. Things that are unverified, things that might not be true, things that are put out by outside sources or even foreign governments. That's obviously illegal. But I'm not aware of any law that prevents any kind of use of social media by any legitimate political actor.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Kamala Harris, being both vice president and candidate, should be replaced by someone else in the session to certify the results.
This is the president of the Union.
So America's a country of institutions. So I think that we would expect from our leadership to be able to separate their role and their duty as an officer of Congress in that case, to do what's required by our electoral laws and what the voters ask for, rather than be sort of swayed by a personal political ambition. So I think that while that could potentially be an issue, I think that there are a lot of institutional protections to prevent that from happening in the United States.
Could you please repeat that?
I think that while that could potentially be an issue, I think there are a lot of institutional protections in the United States to prevent that kind of thing from happening.
Thanks, Professor.
Because my hearing aids were not working well. So I'll go back to the first part when you spoke of primary processes.
Yes.
For me, it has been quite odd that there have been a lot of publicity on television
of new places where you can vote. So the registration for voting apparently is quite loose. I mean, I would like to know why, because our system, so you have to register as a citizen when you're age, you have you can vote. So, and if you want to change the place where you vote, then you have to register for the change, and it's not at all easy. And you have a certain time limit.
Yeah.
Where you have, you can do the change. Can you explain, is this a new addition to the requirements for voting? Why is it so loose?
So voting requirements are state to state. North Carolina has different rules than Michigan has, than Nebraska has. So that's the first one. So states decide that one of the sort of quirks of our constitution, quirks the wrong word, complications of our constitution, is that states run the elections.
Can you speak a little bit, because she doesn't.
So every state is different. Our constitution says that states run the elections.
Thank you.
So you might see some inconsistencies between different states and how they choose to identify voters. I think that in principle, everyone in the United States, every citizen in the United States gets one vote, and that is what we are trying. That is the goal of every election commission at every local level, all the way up to the Federal Election Commission. The way that states choose to accomplish that, or the checks that they put in place, or how easy it is to move from place to place, is entirely dependent on how they would like to run their own system. But as I said, what is important is that everybody gets the vote and that everybody votes once.
I have a couple of questions from the people watching online. What is the geographic distribution of party voters? Are Republican concentrated in some regions or states?
That's a good question. The distribution of party voters changes every year. We talked about what swing states are. That's where the battle lines are drawn, right? So in the Midwest, they sometimes go either way. But generally speaking, and this is a gross exaggeration, please don't quote me on this. The Democratic voters are concentrated on the coasts and in big cities, and Republican voters are concentrated in the center of the country and in rural areas.
Do you need a minimum of votes to have access to public funding?
Yes, in order to get the public funding, you need to secure. I'm not gonna get the number right, but it's a significant number of signatures on a petition that would allow you to A, be on the ballot, and B, secure public funding.
And the last one from the people watching online, why some states take several days to return the results?
Good question. The reason some states take several days to get the returns back is that they're trying to be as correct as possible. When the votes are, when you're deciding, the results in the state based on 1,000, a couple hundred, single numbers of votes, it's incumbent upon the states to get it right. It's incumbent upon the states to get it right the first time, which means sometimes they take a little while longer than we would like. And I think that, we saw some news organizations sort of jump the gun on that in some earlier elections and have to recant calls they had already made based off of exit polling, which are polls taken as people are leaving, how did you vote? I voted this way. So I think that there's been a lot more precision and care applied to the reporting of votes because of those situations in the past.
We have one question from our watchers.
Thank you for being here. I had a question about the online ballot and why some people can vote online and why others have to go voting. I know it has to be something with the number of people that vote in the United States, but if there are other factors that go into it.
So, as I said earlier, the conduct of the elections are state to state. So if a certain area has, a mail-in ballot or requires you to show up in person or show your driver's license, those are all based on state rules. The online balloting is not something that we do a tremendous amount of. In fact, I'm not familiar with that we do it anywhere. Because of a sort of disruptive technology, that's come into our system the past couple of years. So generally speaking, people who are away from their home like me, will request the ballot from the area that they live. That ballot will be mailed to them, or you'll get an email where you print the ballot, send it back. But I think generally speaking, physical ballot is standard in most states. But all that to say, it's state to state. If they're doing something in Oregon, that's not necessarily the same thing that happens in Florida.
I have a question, please. Yeah, to be a candidate, do you have like, what are the minimum requirements?
Oh, geez, I should have said that, right? There are minimum requirements to be president. There's a minimum age. I think it's 38. You have to be a naturally born American citizen. So naturalized people who are naturalized to United States citizenship are not eligible for president. And then I think beyond then, there are other requirements that are in the Constitution that I will not butcher by attempting to remember. But there's minimum age and you have to be a natural born US citizen of the two are the two sort of major ones.
One more question over there.
Thank you. Based on your experience and your knowledge, and given how controversial the electoral college compared to the popular vote is, do you think that maybe someday this could change, or is it just such an establishment of the U.S. election?
So the method by which that would change is an amendment to the Constitution. The way the Constitution is amended in the United States is through a 2/3 vote of states, through an amendment process that's very long. So all that to say that given the fact that Congress is controlled by a hair's breadth, and states are broken out almost 50-50 the same way, I think it's very unlikely that the United States would come to a consensus on that. There are, we mentioned the criticism of the electoral college, but there are also pros, right? I think a critic would say, obviously my vote in Wyoming is worth more because I can, or I guess my vote in New York is worth more because it matters to 50 electoral votes as opposed to the vote in Wyoming. But that vote in Wyoming also has to matter, right? Like we don't want New York to be deciding on everything that happens in Wyoming, Nebraska, and everywhere else. So in the electoral college and the way that our Congress is broken out, is a check against that. I don't think pragmatically it's very likely that the process would be successful. But B, I also think that there are advantages to the electoral college, and there's a robust debate to be had about whether that'd be a good idea to begin with.
We have a practical question from one of the people attending online. Do you recommend any public opinion survey to follow up the pre-election process?
Do I recommend any specific survey?
Yes.
So I think what we've learned about polling in the past, 12 years probably, is that any single poll doesn't mean anything. I think the right way to look at that data is to aggregate it and look at collections of polls, and also not to take any single data point as anything more than a statistic. So yeah, I would pay attention to people to analysts of polls who tell you that, who say like, this was conducted, this has this sample size, it happened at this time. And if a pollster is taking into account the many complications with polling and casting their results in a way that that accepts the limitations that are associated with it, then yeah, you can pay attention to that and you can include that in your analysis. But anyone who tells you like, I polled Pennsylvania, I polled 1,000 people in Pennsylvania yesterday, and 999 of them said they wanted Harris, so she's definitely going to win. Like that person is probably wrong.
Perfect. Do we have more questions or comments? No? One more.
I'm sorry, there are many questions, I think. One of them is, I understand that electoral votes are shared according to the district that you belong to. In other words, registration as for voting is really well monitored. In other words, is it at all possible that one or more electoral votes do not vote correctly? And what would be the penalty in case it happened? I know that it is very difficult, but could it happen? And if it did, what's the penalty?
Could it happen? Yes. My understanding, please, do more research on this because we're getting to the edges of my knowledge. My understanding is that there are no legal ramifications for an elector not doing what the voters said to do. I think that if that was in place, then perhaps that's what the congressional certification process is for. If New York's electors decide they were going to ignore what the people said and do this instead, then we have the congressional certification process. We say like, this is not correct. What happens after that? Like, 2 words, constitutional crisis. Like, no one is helped, but there's not there's no like built-in penalty at the FEC or something like that is automatic on those people. It would cause a major crisis in the non-certification of the election.
Just by curiosity, it's not all states apply the district allocation of votes. Not all of the states. Then it's a single unit or.
And most states are winner take all, meaning that if 50% plus one vote for one party, vote for one candidate, then all of the state's electors go to that candidate. Some states are proportional.
Well, Maine and Nebraska, I think, are proportional, no?
Yeah.
That this is designed because you may choose areas in which you can put the
Gerrymandering.
gerrymandering. Yes. What happens with that?
So gerrymandering is a pejorative term for redistricting, which can be a natural occurrence. I mentioned every 10 years we do a census in the United States that determines how many people live where and how we're going to reallocate votes in Congress based on that. I mentioned that they're proportional to in the lower house they're proportional to population. At that same time, the districts are redrawn on a map, for various reasons. And they're redrawn, actually, we mentioned earlier, the power of political parties. Political parties do that. So what gerrymandering is the sort of nonsensical redrawing of a political party, of a district in order to advantage one party or the other, which can, in the aggregate affect the overall election because, if 100% of the Democrats vote here and 0% vote here, then you could end up throwing the 5 other districts that are closer to Republicans. So it's a very sort of political process. A lot of arguments happen about it. One interesting anecdote that actually one of our colleagues mentioned is that he worked for a congressperson who lived in a district that they referred to as the earmuffs. And you guys know earmuffs is probably a word that it's you put 1 ear. And so this congressman had downtown Buffalo, which is a big city in New York, downtown Rochester, which is a medium-sized city in New York, and then a little line that connected them. And that was her district because it was gerrymandered to help the Democrats out. So that kind of thing does happen, yes.
Thanks, Chase. Very informative, and I would like to thank the embassy for supporting Diana and Carolina for supporting the American Studies program. So, thank you. October, we have an activity with the ambassador of the US to the OAS, yes, and Antonio Rafora on democracy and
La tenemos en español, así que la puedes tener en español.
So the 17th of October, here at the institute. So more than welcome and thanks again, Chief, for.
Highly encourage you all to attend that.
1:30, yes.
Ambassador Moran is an excellent speaker and is very expert in these topics.
Thank you very much again. See you.